What a strange passage to our postmodern ears. Beelzebul, Satan, demons, what is this about? Jesus takes seriously the realities of Satan and other demonic powers, including Beelzebub, whose name means Lord of the Flies. Did Jesus believe that a personality named Satan actually existed? Perhaps, and that makes this passage difficult to preach. Yet we should also look for the reality that is symbolized by the name Satan. Satan does not necessarily mean a personality with horns and a red tail, but it does name a demonic power that is actively engaged against the compassionate and reconciling love of God. This is the reality that Jesus is naming here. And whether we believe in a person named Satan is not as important as hearing how we are captive to the powers of evil that are symbolized by the name Satan, powers that continue to seek our allegiance, powers that exist, yes, even especially in the church. Stated this way, the reality of Satan and Beelzebub become disturbingly clear. They name the forces of power that capture us and cause us to hurt ourselves, hurt others, and hurt God. I'll just name a few of these powers. There is the power of race, which tells us to believe that one group is superior to another simply because of skin color or cultural heritage. There is the power of patriarchy that tells us that men should dominate women. There is the power of militarism, the belief that weapons and war bring us peace and security, causing us to kill one another, often in the name of God. And there is the power of money, which tells us that the more money a person has, the more influence that person's voice should have in an organization. I have had personal experience of all these powers at loose in various churches that I have served, holding them captive from the freedom that Jesus promises. And in these verses in Mark, Jesus indicates that the power of these categories that I described have got to be recognized and confronted if we are to experience the gracious and stunning love of God. And he calls these powers strong men. And he uses the metaphor, the parable of tying up that strong man in order to plunder his property. And in using this parable of the strong man, Jesus speaks of the need of the gospel to expose where we are captive to the strong men in our lives, in our churches. The strong man of white racism, the strong man of male patriarchy, the strong man of militarism, and the strong man of the power that we hand over to those with money. In this parable of tying up those strong men, Jesus seeks to free up our imaginations, which have become the property of Satan. Our captivity to Satan must be exposed in order for us to begin to discover the glorious freedom of the children of God. As Paul puts it so powerfully in his letter to the Romans, he writes that in hope, even creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So how is it that we become captive to the powers and forces that are symbolized by the name Satan? These powers of racism, of patriarchy, of militarism, and the voice of those with money who wish to control those without. In this passage, Jesus names one central source of our captivity, and he demonstrates how deeply captive we are and how difficult this process of discovery is. And it's because we're family. Jesus' family comes to take him home because people are saying that he's insane. He's sick. He's hurting. And in his reply to his family's request to see him, Jesus stings his family by almost disowning them. "Who are my mother and brothers and sisters?" he asked. And he answers himself, "Whoever does the will of God." This is not the only time that Jesus wrestles with his family. Remember, it began when he was 12 years old, and he stayed behind in Jerusalem so that he could talk with the priests in the temple. And his family said, "Where is he?" And they go back, and his mother says, "Why have you done this to us?" He says, "I have to be about my Father's business." Or the next point where he had a bone of contention, if you will, with his mother was at the wedding in Cana, where she comes and asks him to take care of the dwindled wine supply in this wedding, and he's irritated. And then in Luke, Jesus says, "I came to bring division, not tranquility." In his response to his family's request to see him in our passage today, he reminds them and us that those who take care of us, those who love us, those who nurture us, can also bind us to Satan, to these powers. I can name several personal experiences that could demonstrate this process of how loved ones, including fellow church members, can bind us to these powers. And I will share, however, a story involving my own father in the Baptist church from which he grew up. And the strong man, the power, was the power of racism. My dad was taught very well from his church that the races simply should not mix. And when I moved away from home in the 1970s and began dating a black FBI agent with whom I worked, my father threatened to disown me from the family if I continued that relationship. And as I came to hear other voices from God's Spirit, voices that told me that racism was not God's will, I began to be in internal conflict with my father and with his church community. It was a struggle. And I began to appreciate why Jesus calls these forces Satan, and I understood why Jesus had indicated that his family might be part of the problem. In this passage, Jesus is not being anti-family. Family was very important to him. In fact, in John's Gospel, as Jesus is dying on the cross, one of his last acts is to make certain that care will be provided for his mother on his death. And I have to say that for my own part, my greatest resource in life continues to be my father, who died at the age of 50, and also his Baptist church that nurtured me as a child. This is a difficult passage, and it's rooted in conflict and danger, and it reminds us of the difficulty of following Jesus. It reminds us that, yes, the danger for powers to bind us in the church and prevent us from being the free children of God who reflect God's glory, it is true, and it is powerful, and it is present. But this text also reminds us of the great possibilities that happen when we confront those powers and when we bind them with exposure. If we only have the smallest amount of faith, because great results pour out from that. But that's next week's text. So I invite you to stay tuned for next week to see indeed how those powers can be bound and the gospel can set loose in a wonderful way.